The dry earth's curse. The soil was not just dry, it was angry. It cracked like broken glass under Okoro's bare feet, mocking the seeds he had buried weeks ago. In the village of Umuoyai, rain was no longer a gift from the heavens, it was a memory that had faded into the dust. Okoro knelt in his field, clutching a handful of dirt that crumbled into gray powder. His stomach growled, a hollow echoing sound that reminded him of his failing life. Beside him stood his youngest daughter, Adana. She was only 6, but her eyes held the weariness of an old woman. Her ribcage poked through her thin tunic, and her lips were chapped white. "Papa, will the corn wake up today?" she whispered. Okoro couldn't look at her. How could he tell her that the earth was dead? How could he tell her that their last goat had been sold for a bag of grain that was now mostly weevils? The desperation was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest. That night, as the village fell into a hungry silence, Okoro sat outside his hut. He watched the moon, which hung in the sky like a cold, silver eye. He was a good man, or at least he had tried to be. But goodness didn't put yam pottage on the table. Goodness didn't stop his wife, Neka, from crying softly in the dark so the children wouldn't hear. "There is a way," a voice hissed from the shadows of the irako tree. Okoro jumped, his heart hammering against his ribs. Out of the darkness stepped Matsi Dibia, the village's most feared medicine man. He was draped in charms that clattered like dry bones. People said he could talk to the winds and bargain with the dead. Okoro usually avoided him, fearing the darkness that clung to the old man like a second skin. "I have no money for charms, Dibia," Okoro said, his voice trembling. "I do not want your money, Okoro. I want to give you some," the Dibia replied, a twisted smile stretching across his face. "You are a man who loves his family. But love cannot be eaten. Would you not give anything to see them feast? To see your wife draped in the finest lace and your children's bellies full?" Okoro thought of Adana's ribs. He thought of Neka's fading beauty. The hunger in his own gut twisted like a snake. "What must I do?" The Dibia leaned in, the scent of rot and ancient herbs filling Okoro's nostrils. "Deep in the forest of whispers, there is a bird that does not eat meat. It eats the poverty of men and leaves behind the weight of kings. Meet me at the crossroads when the moon is at its peak. Bring nothing but your greed." Okoro watched the Dibia vanish back into the trees. The air felt colder, and the silence of the village felt heavier. He looked at his small, crumbling hut. He was a desperate man, and desperation is the perfect soil for a dark seed to grow. He didn't know then that the price of gold is often paid in things that gold can never buy. The crossroads at midnight. The crossroads was a place where the world of the living and the world of the spirits bled into one. Okoro stood there, his hands shaking. He had crept out of his hut, leaving Neka and the children sleeping. He felt like a thief in his own life. The wind howled through the tall grass, sounding like the screams of forgotten ancestors. Matsi Dibia appeared as if he had grown out of the ground itself. In his hands, he carried a cage covered in a cloth of deep, bruised purple. Something shifted inside the cage, something heavy and restless. "You came," the Dibia remarked. "Many men talk of sacrifice, but few walk the path when the shadows grow long." "Give me the bird," Okoro said, his voice cracking. "I want the hunger to end." "This is the vulture of the sunken sun," the Dibia explained, his voice dropping to a rhythmic chant. "It does not fly. It does not sing. It only waits. To wake its power, you must feed it a drop of your own blood every full moon. In return, it will vomit the gold of the ancient ones. You will be richer than the king of Onitsha." He pulled back the purple cloth. Inside was the ugliest creature Okoro had ever seen. It was a vulture, but its feathers were the color of dried blood, and its head was completely bald, covered in pulsing blue veins. Its eyes were not bird-like. They were pale, intelligent, and filled with a terrifying hunger. It stared at Okoro, and for a moment he felt his soul turn cold. "But remember," the Dibia warned, his eyes narrowing, "the earth demands a balance. For every gift of gold, there is a silence. The vulture takes what it needs to fuel its magic. Do you accept the bargain?" Okoro looked at the bird. He saw the reflection of the moon in its dull eyes, but he also saw images of overflowing granaries and chests filled with cowries. He thought of the village elders who looked down on him. He thought of the power to never be hungry again. "I accept," Okoro whispered. The dibia handed him the cage. It was surprisingly heavy, as if it were filled with lead. "Go home, Okoro. Place the cage in the corner of your room. Cover it. Never let your children touch it. When the first rays of light hit the floor, you will see your first blessing." As Okoro walked back to the village, the vulture let out a low, guttural croak. It sounded almost like a human sob. He shivered and quickened his pace. He told himself he was doing this for them. He was doing this for his family. But as he reached his hut, he noticed that the crickets had stopped chirping. The world had gone silent, as if it were holding its breath in horror. The first silence. The morning sun crept through the cracks in the mud walls. Okoro had not slept. He sat on the floor, staring at the purple cloth covering the cage. Beside him, Neka was beginning to stir. "Okoro, why are you awake so early?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. She noticed the cage. "What is that? Did you catch a bushmeat?" "It is a gift, Neka." "A blessing from an old friend," Okoro said, his heart racing. He stood up and slowly lifted the cloth. The vulture sat perfectly still, its pale eyes fixed on him. At the bottom of the cage, resting in the filth, was a heavy, jagged lump of pure gold. It glowed with an unnatural light, casting long shadows across the room. Neka gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Okoro, is that real?" Okoro reached in, his fingers trembling, and pulled out the metal. It was warm to the touch, almost pulsing like a heartbeat. "We are rich, Neka. No more hunger. No more begging for scraps." He turned to call Adana, to tell her she could have all the honey cakes she wanted. Adana was sitting on her sleeping mat, her eyes wide as she looked at the gold. "Adana, look!" Okoro cried out. "Look what Papa found." Adana opened her mouth to speak. Her lips moved, and her throat worked as if she were trying to scream with joy. But no sound came out. She clutched her throat, her eyes filling with tears of confusion. She tried again, pushing air from her lungs, but the room remained silent. "Adana!" Neka rushed to her side. "Speak to me, child. What is wrong?" The girl began to cry, but even her sobs were silent. It was as if the sound had been erased from the world. Okoro looked at the gold in his hand, then at the vulture. The bird let out a dry, clicking sound and tucked its head under its wing. A wave of nausea hit Okoro. For every gift of gold, there is a silence. The dibia's words echoed in his mind. He had his first piece of gold, and in exchange, his youngest daughter had lost her voice. "It's just the excitement," Okoro lied, his voice shaking. "She is just overwhelmed. Her voice will return by midday." But deep down, he knew the truth. He looked at the gold again. It was beautiful, but it felt heavier than it had a moment ago. He had traded Adana's laughter for a piece of yellow rock. And the most terrifying part? He didn't put the gold back. He clutched it tight, the price of velvet. The gold was not enough. It was never enough. Within a week, Okoro had traded the jagged lump for sacks of grain, fine yams, and a crate of expensive palm wine. But as the food filled their bellies, the silence in the house grew deafening. Adana moved like a ghost, her mouth a frozen line of terror. Every time she tried to scream, only a dry, whistling sound escaped her throat. Neka was frantic. She dragged the girl to the village herbalist's, but they found nothing wrong with her throat. "It is a spiritual lock," they whispered behind Okoro's back. But Okoro was no longer listening to whispers. He was looking at the vulture. The bird had grown larger. Its blue veins pulsed with a rhythmic throb, and its scent, a mix of old blood and copper, filled the room. Okoro felt a dark hunger of his own. The gold had brought him respect. The elders who once ignored him now bowed. "One more piece," Okoro muttered to the shadows. "Just enough to build a house of stone. Then I will stop." That night, he approached the cage. The air around the bird felt thick, like wading through mud. He pricked his finger with a thorn, letting a thick drop of blood fall onto the bird's bald head. The vulture didn't flinch. It absorbed the blood like a sponge. The next morning, 2 heavy bars of gold sat in the cage. Okoro's heart soared, until he heard the crash from the kitchen. He rushed in to find his eldest son, Chidi, standing over a broken pot. Chidi was a boy of 16, known for his constant singing and sharp wit. "Chidi, watch your feet," Okoro barked. Chidi turned to his father. His eyes were wide, bulging with a horrific realization. He opened his mouth to apologize, but only a hollow, raspy wind came out. He clawed at his neck, his face turning purple as he fought to produce a single syllable. Neka walked in, seeing her son's silent agony. She looked at Okoro, then at the heavy gold bars tucked under his arm. "What have you done?" she whispered. Okoro didn't answer. He couldn't. If he acknowledged the trade, the reality would shatter him. He simply pushed past her, the gold cold against his ribs. The stone mansion. The mud hut was gone. In its place rose a structure of stone and imported wood, a monstrosity that loomed over the village of Umuoyai like a tomb. Okoro wore robes of heavy velvet that dragged in the dust, and his fingers were weighted down by rings. But inside the stone walls, the house was a graveyard of sound. His children, Adana and Chidi, sat at a table overflowing with roasted meats and seasoned rice. They ate in a vacuum. There was no clatter of forks, no laughter, no "thank you." Even the sound of their chewing seemed muffled by an invisible force. They looked at their father with eyes full of accusation and dread. Neka had grown thin. Her beauty had been replaced by a sharp, jagged anxiety. She spent her days scrubbing the floors, trying to wash away a scent that only she could smell, the scent of the vulture. "Sell the gold, Okoro," she pleaded one night. Her voice was the only one left besides his, and it sounded fragile, like cracking ice. "Take us back to the hut. We will eat dust, but I want to hear my children's voices again. I want to hear Chidi sing. And go back to being a beggar." Okoro spat, slamming his cup onto the table. The sound was unnaturally loud in the silent house. "I have given them everything. They wear silk. They eat like gods. They are prisoners in a golden cage." Neka screamed. Okoro walked to the locked room at the back of the house. He didn't tell her that the vulture now required more than a drop of blood. It required a bowl. He felt weak, his own skin turning a sickly gray, but the sight of the gold in the cage acted like a drug. The vulture was now the size of a small dog. It no longer sat on a perch, it stood on its powerful taloned feet, watching the door. As Okoro entered, the bird tilted its head. It didn't make a sound, but Okoro heard a voice in his mind, a cold, oily slide of words. "The woman speaks too much, does she not? Her voice is a sharp thorn in your side. Wouldn't the gold taste sweeter without her nagging?" Okoro trembled. "Not my wife. Not Neka." The vulture's eyes glowed a dull, hellish red. It vomited a pile of gold coins that cascaded onto the floor with a sound like falling teeth. The final echo. The village of Umuoyai began to fear the House of Silence. No one visited. Even the bravest hunters took the long path around Okoro's land. They said that if you stood near the walls at night, you could feel the air being sucked out of your own lungs. Okoro was now the richest man in the land, but he was a ghost. He spent his days counting his coins, his ears ringing with a constant high-pitched hum. He found he could no longer stand the sound of Neka's voice. Every word she spoke felt like a physical blow to his head. "Okoro, please," she said as he sat in his counting room. "Adana is sick. She won't eat. She just stares at the wall. She's fading away. Leave me." Okoro shouted. "Look at me." Neka grabbed his velvet robes. "You are trading our souls for rocks. The Dibia didn't give you a blessing, he gave you a parasite." Okoro looked at her. He saw the woman he had loved, but her voice was so loud. It was a cacophony that disrupted his peace. He thought of the vulture's red eyes. He thought of the mountain of gold he could have if the house were truly, perfectly quiet. "I said, be silent," he roared. He stomped to the back room. He didn't even use a thorn this time. He took a small knife and sliced his palm, letting the blood flow freely into the vulture's waiting beak. The bird hissed, its feathers ruffling with a sound like dry leaves on a coffin. The next morning, Okoro woke up to a sensation of profound peace. The house was still. Perfectly still. He walked into the master bedroom. Neko was sitting by the window, watching the sun rise. She turned to him, her eyes streaming with tears. She opened her mouth to tell him she was leaving him, to tell him he was a monster. Nothing. Not a breath. Not a whisper. She clawed at her throat, her face contorting in a silent wail of agony. She looked at her husband and saw not a man, but a hollow shell draped in gold. Okoro felt a surge of triumph, followed immediately by a cold, soul-crushing realization. He was now the only person in the world who could speak. And he had absolutely nothing left to say. He walked to the vulture's room. The bird was massive now, its wingspan stretching across the entire chamber. It wasn't in its cage anymore. The wood had been splintered. The vulture sat on the pile of gold, its pale eyes fixed on Okoro's throat. "Now," the voice in his head whispered, "it is just you and me, Okoro. Let us talk about the price of the final harvest." The Feast of Shadows. The house was no longer a home, it was a museum of the living dead. Okoro sat at the head of a mahogany table that could seat 20, but only 4 sat there. The air was thick with the smell of roasted gazelle and palm oil, yet the room felt like a tomb. Adana sat to his left, her eyes hollow, staring at a silver spoon. Chidi sat to his right, his hands trembling so violently he couldn't hold his cup. Neko sat at the far end, her gaze fixed on the wall behind Okoro. She didn't look at him anymore. To her, he was the ghost, and the vulture in the back room was the master of the house. Okoro picked up a chicken leg, the grease staining his velvet sleeves. "Eat," he commanded. His voice bounced off the stone walls, sounding harsh and lonely. "This is the finest meat in the province. Do you know what I paid for this?" Silence. Neko didn't even flinch. She simply picked up a piece of bread and chewed, the sound of her teeth grinding the only noise in the room. Okoro felt a sudden, irrational rage. He wanted them to scream. He wanted them to curse him. He wanted anything other than this suffocating, heavy nothingness. "I did this for you," he roared, standing up so quickly his chair toppled over. Adana flinched, but she didn't cry. You cannot cry out loud when the sound has been stolen from your soul. She simply looked at him with a pity that burned worse than any insult. Okoro stormed out of the dining hall and headed for the locked room. He needed to see it. He needed to justify the agony. He unlocked the heavy iron door and stepped inside. The stench of the vulture was now unbearable, a mix of stagnant water and old graves. The bird was no longer a bird. It had grown human-like shoulders, and its bald head was covered in thick, pulsing veins that seemed to glow in the dark. It sat atop a mountain of gold coins, its talons clicking against the metal. "They hate you, Okoro," the voice hissed in his skull. "They eat your bread and sleep in your beds, but in their hearts, they are sharpening knives. Why keep them? Why share the gold with those who despise the giver?" "They are my blood," Okoro whispered, his eyes fixed on a particularly large gold nugget. "Blood is just red water," the vulture replied. "Silence is the only truth. Give me the rest, Okoro. Give me the final echoes, and I will give you the sun itself." The desperate journey. Okoro couldn't sleep. The silence of the house had begun to hum. It was a low-frequency vibration that made his teeth ache. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Adana's silent tears and Neko's dead eyes. He realized then that he was dying. Not of hunger, but of isolation. He was the king of a kingdom of mutes. Under the cover of a moonless night, Okoro fled. He didn't take the gold. He didn't take his velvet robes. He ran into the forest of whispers, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had to find Motsi Dibia. He had to give it back. He would burn the stone mansion. He would dig in the dirt with his fingernails if only he could hear Adana say, "Papa," one more time. The forest was different now. The trees seemed to lean toward him, their branches like skeletal fingers. The wind didn't whistle, it groaned. "Dibia!" Okoro screamed into the darkness. "Motsi Dibia! I want to break the bargain!" A chuckle drifted through the trees, cold and dry. From behind a massive silk cotton tree, the medicine man emerged. He looked younger, his skin supple and his eyes bright with a terrifying energy. He was wearing a necklace made of gold coins, Okoro's gold. "The bird is growing well, I see," Dibia said, his voice smooth as oil. "Take it back," Okoro begged, falling to his knees in the mud. "It took their voices. It took my wife's soul. I have the gold, but I am starving in my spirit." Dibia leaned down, his face inches from Okoro's. "You misunderstand the nature of greed, Okoro. You don't own the vulture. The vulture owns the space where your heart used to be. The bargain cannot be broken by the one who benefited from it." "There must be a way." "There is," Dibia whispered. "But it requires a different kind of sacrifice. The vulture has tasted your blood, but it craves your identity. To free them, you must become the silence yourself. The mirror of regret." Okoro returned to the stone mansion as the sun began to bleed over the horizon. He looked at the structure. It looked like a giant gray tooth rotting in the jaw of the earth. He walked into the parlor. Neko was standing there, holding a small bundle. She had packed her things. She was leaving. She couldn't speak, but her actions were loud enough. She pointed to the children, who stood behind her, their faces set in grim masks. Okoro reached out to touch Adana's hair, but she stepped back, her eyes filled with a pure, unadulterated horror. She didn't see her father. She saw the man who had traded her voice for a silver spoon. "Wait," Okoro said. He walked to the back room. He didn't hesitate this time. He opened the door and walked straight to the vulture. The creature stood nearly 7 feet tall now. It didn't look like a bird at all. It looked like a nightmare carved from obsidian and greed. "I offer a new deal," Okoro said, his voice steady for the first time in months. The vulture's eyes flared a brilliant, toxic red. "Speak, little meat. Give them back their voices. Let them walk out of this house and never remember the gold or the silence. Take the mansion. Take the gold. Take me." The vulture tilted its head, a long black tongue flickering over its beak. "You would trade your existence for their noise? You would become the very thing you feared." "Yes," Okoro said. The vulture lunged. Its talons sank into Okoro's shoulders, but there was no pain, only a sudden, terrifying coldness. He felt his voice being pulled out of his throat like a long, silver thread. He felt his memories of the gold dissolving into ash. Outside the room, in the parlor, Adana suddenly gasped. A sharp, clear sound broke the air. "Mama," she whispered. Neko dropped her bundle, her hands flying to her throat. "Adana! Oh, my light! Chidi! I can hear you!" Chidi sobbed, his voice cracking with joy. "I can hear the wind." They turned toward the back room, a flicker of hope in their eyes. "Okoro!" Neko called out. "Okoro, did you do it?" They pushed open the heavy iron door. The room was empty. There was no gold. There was no vulture. There was only a pile of gray dust in the center of the floor and a single blood-red feather resting on a heap of old, dry bones. Okoro was gone. But as they ran from the house, the wind seemed to carry a faint, ghostly whisper, a sound of a man finally saying, "I'm sorry," though there was no one left to hear it, the echo of the feather. The stone mansion did not crumble when Okoro vanished. Instead, it seemed to sour. The air inside turned stagnant, smelling of wet soot and things that had died a long time ago. Neko did not stay to watch the sunset. She grabbed her children and fled, leaving the gold, the velvet, and the ghost of her husband behind. They moved to a small hut on the far edge of the village, a place where the earth was still stubborn but the air was clean. For the first few days, the sound of their own voices was a miracle. Adana laughed just to hear the vibration in her chest. Chidi sang until his throat was sore. "We are free," Neko whispered one night, tucking Adana into a bed of straw. But as the moon rose, a cold shiver traveled down Neko's spine. She reached into the pocket of her wrap to find a small stone, but her fingers brushed against something soft and sharp. She pulled it out. It was the blood-red feather. She had seen it on the floor of the vulture's room. She thought she had left it there. How had it found its way into her clothes? She tried to throw it into the hearth, but the fire hissed and pulled away from the quill. The feather did not burn. It sat among the glowing embers, as vibrant and red as a fresh wound. "Mama, why is the fire scared?" Adana asked from the shadows. Neka didn't answer. She grabbed a stick and poked the feather out of the flames. It was cold to the touch. Even more terrifying was the weight of it. It felt as heavy as a gold coin. That night, Neka dreamt of Okoro. He wasn't the man she loved, nor was he the rich monster in velvet. He was a shadow with no mouth, wandering a desert of yellow dust, trying to scream but only exhaling the scent of rotting meat. The village of whispers. Umuoyai was no longer welcoming. The villagers looked at Neka and her children with eyes full of suspicion. They had seen the family live like royalty while the rest of the village starved. They had seen the House of Silence, and believed the family had traded their neighbors' luck for wealth. "Where is the gold, Neka?" Motsi Igui, the village head, asked during a gathering at the square. "Okoro is gone. The mansion stands empty. Surely, a wife knows where the treasure is buried." "There is no gold," Neka said, her voice trembling. "It was a curse. It nearly killed us." "A curse that buys silk and stone," a woman mocked from the crowd. "Give us our share, or leave this village. We will not have your silent bad luck rubbing off on our crops." Neka looked at the faces of her people. They were hungry, and hunger makes men cruel. She realized then that greed hadn't died with Okoro. It had simply jumped from his heart into the hearts of the entire village. As she walked home, she noticed a group of young men heading toward the stone mansion with pickaxes and shovels. They were going to tear the walls apart to find the vulture's gold. "Don't go there!" Neka shouted, but they ignored her. That evening, a terrible sound echoed from the direction of the mansion. It wasn't a scream. It was the sound of 1,000 birds flapping their wings at once. A dark cloud rose from the chimney of the stone house, blotting out the stars. Neka clutched the red feather in her pocket. It was pulsing. It felt like a tiny, frantic heart beating against her hip. The new hunger. By midnight, the young men returned from the mansion. They didn't bring gold. They didn't bring silver. They walked into the village square with their heads down, their eyes glazed and milky. "Did you find it?" Motsi Igui demanded. The men opened their mouths to answer. They strained. Their neck muscles stood out like cords. But no words came. They looked at each other in horror, clawing at their throats just as Adana and Chidi once had. The silence had returned. But this time, it hadn't been bought. It had been stolen. Neka watched from her doorway, her heart sinking. She understood now. The vulture hadn't left. It had simply waited for new mouths to feed its hunger for greed. The gold the men had touched in the mansion, the few coins left in the floorboards, had acted as a hook. A shadow fell over her hut. She looked up to see Motsi Dibia standing there. He looked older now, his skin sagging, his eyes dim. "You have the feather," he whispered. "Take it back." Neka cried, thrusting the red quill toward him. "It's starting again. The village, the boys, they can't speak." Dibia shook his head. "I cannot take what was given as a sacrifice. Okoro traded his soul for their voices. But the vulture is a creature of the earth. It cannot be full. It is now looking for a new host to grow its hoard." "Who?" Neka asked, though she already knew the answer. Dibia pointed to the red feather in her hand. It was no longer just a feather. Small, blue veins were beginning to sprout from the quill, wrapping around Neka's wrist like a living bracelet. "It chose you, Neka," Dibia hissed. "Because you are the only one who knows what the silence is worth. Will you be a mother, or will you be a queen?" The Queen of Whispers. The blue veins from the feather didn't just wrap around Neka's wrist, they sank into her skin. They felt like tiny, frozen needles seeking the heat of her blood. By morning, the village of Umuoyai was a tomb of moving ghosts. The young men who had raided the mansion sat in the dirt, their mouths hanging open, unable to even moan in frustration. Motsi Igui, the village head, marched toward Neka's hut. He was followed by a mob of angry parents, their faces twisted in silent fury. They couldn't speak, but they carried torches and heavy clubs. They pointed at Neka, their eyes accusing her of stealing the voices of their sons to pay for her own children's recovery. "Leave us!" Neka shouted, stepping in front of Adana and Chidi. The mob didn't stop. They moved like a slow, heavy wave. A stone flew through the air, clipping Neka's forehead. Blood trickled down her face, staining her vision red. Suddenly, the feather on her wrist began to vibrate. A cold, oily voice, the same one that had hollowed out Okoro's soul, echoed in her mind. "They will kill your children, Neka. They think you are a witch. Why suffer their stones? One word from you, one wish, and they will bow." "No!" Neka screamed internally. "Look at Adana," the voice hissed. "She is trembling. Look at Chidi. He is looking for a weapon. Do you want them to die in the dirt because you are too proud to be powerful?" Neka looked at the mob. A man raised a torch, ready to fling it onto her thatched roof. The desperation she had felt when they were starving returned, but this time it was sharper, laced with the scent of burning oil. "Stop!" she roared. As she spoke, a wave of visible, distorted air rippled out from her chest. The torches flickered and died. The men carrying them fell to their knees, clutching their ears as if 1,000 bells had been struck at once. In the silence that followed, Neka felt a sickening surge of triumph. The feather turned a deeper shade of crimson. She wasn't just a mother anymore. She was the only authority left in a world that had gone mute. The golden harvest of tears. The transformation was swifter than Okoro's. Within 3 days, the villagers had stopped fighting. They realized that Neka held the key to the silence. They began to bring her gifts, not out of love, but out of a terrifying, primal hope that she would give them back their voices. They brought baskets of the finest yams, jugs of expensive palm wine, and pieces of jewelry they had hidden for generations. Neka accepted them all. She told herself she was building a safety fund for her children. "Mama, why are they crying while they give us food?" Adana asked, watching a woman lay a beaded necklace at Neka's feet. The woman's face was wet with tears, her mouth working in a silent, desperate prayer. "They are paying their debts, Adana," Neka said, her voice sounding different, sharper, like the edge of a blade. Neka moved her children back into the stone mansion. She didn't need the vulture to vomit gold. The villagers were her vulture now. They stripped their own lives bare to satisfy the woman who controlled the quiet. She sat in the high-backed chair where Okoro once sat. The red feather had grown into a plume that draped over her shoulder like a royal cape. But at night, the price began to show. Neka started to lose her sense of taste. The finest roasted meat tasted like dry ash. The sweetest wine felt like vinegar. Her skin grew pale and translucent, and she found she could no longer sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the phantom voices of the village, the screams they couldn't make, the curses they were thinking. "You are doing well, Queen," the voice whispered. "But the children, they are still too loud. Their laughter disturbs the harvest. Don't you find their singing annoying?" Neka looked at Chidi, who was practicing a new song in the courtyard. For a split second, she felt a flash of irritation so hot it frightened her. She wanted him to stop. She wanted everything to be perfectly, beautifully still. The mother's mercy. The breaking point came when Adana fell. The girl had been playing on the stone balcony when she tripped and sliced her knee on a jagged rock. She cried out in pain, a sharp, piercing scream that echoed through the halls of the mansion. Neka, sitting in her counting room, flinched. The sound hit her like a physical blow to the heart. The feather on her shoulder bristled, turning black at the tips. "Silence her," the voice commanded. "The noise is poison. Take the echo, and the pain will vanish. Give her the gift of the quiet." Neka rushed to the balcony. She saw Adana sobbing, clutching her bloody knee. Neka reached out, her hand trembling. The blue veins on her wrist pulsed, reaching toward the girl's throat like hungry snakes. "Mama, it hurts," Adana wailed. Neka's fingers hovered inches from Adana's neck. She felt the power surging, ready to pull the scream out of the girl and turn it into another bar of gold in her mind. But then, she looked into Adana's eyes. She saw the same terror she had seen in the House of Silence months ago. She saw the ghost of Okoro staring back at her through her own reflection in the girl's pupils. "I am the monster," Neka whispered. The realization shattered the dark spell. Neka grabbed her own wrist, trying to tear the feather away. It wouldn't budge. It was part of her nervous system now. "Chidi! Adana! Run!" Neka screamed. Leave this house. Go to the Forest of Whispers. Find the Dibia. Tell him the queen is dead. Mama, no. Chitty cried, grabbing her arm. Go. Necka roared, her voice cracking the stone floor. As the children fled, Necka turned toward the locked room at the back of the house. She knew what she had to do. The vulture didn't want gold anymore, it wanted a vessel. She walked into the room and saw the spirit of the vulture, no longer a bird, but a swirling mass of shadows and red eyes. You want a host? Necka challenged, her voice booming with a power that wasn't hers. Take me. All of me. But you will stay in this stone tomb until the earth swallows it whole. She slammed the iron door and locked it from the inside. She threw the key into the shadows and sat on the floor, clutching the red feather. The silence began to fill the room, but this time it was Necka's silence. She willed it to stay within the walls. She felt her lungs turning to stone, her heart slowing to a dull thud. Outside, the village of Umuoyai suddenly erupted in a cacophony of sound. Men shouted. Women wept. The young men found their voices and began to howl with relief. The curse had been drawn back into the heart of the mansion.